Alchemy can be a messy art, a fact known better by the Golden Crucible than many other scientists of the Iron Kingdoms. One does not simply turn lead into gold without a few accidents along the way. The Crucible Guard is not shy when it comes to human experimentation, which has led to several messy failures over the years. Not every failed human experiment is disintegrated in the process or reduced to a sentient mass of quivering flesh. Some failed experiments grow bestial, monstrous, and highly effective at causing destruction among the enemy ranks. Like faithful canines, these failed experiments are given simple commands and sent howling at the foes of the Crucible Guard, where they will cause unimaginable havoc. Whether they live or die in the process is irrelevant, as this secondary experiment is almost always a smashing success. Thanks for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name is Brian, and in this video we're going to be conducting an experiment of our own. In the past I've done Theme Force reviews, and those get a little wonky. There's just so many facets to them, especially since I started off with like Flames and Warriors of the Old Faith. There's so many different moving parts to those that it's just too hard to kind of put together in one video. So I decided that I would try and do like a unit review so we could kind of zoom in on a very particular item and then talk about Synergies and its role within the faction or within the game. So since I've been really interested in Crucible Guard and I've really been enjoying this unit a lot, it made thematic sense to start off with the Failed Experiments. This unit comes in at 8 points for a leader and 2 grunts, and then a leader and 5 grunts ends up coming out to 14 points. They are FA2, a 40mm based unit with 5 wounds on each model. In terms of stats, we get a Speed 6, Strength 6, Mat 6, Rat 2 unit with Def 13 and Arm 15 and a very small command of 6. In addition to that, this unit has Tough, and then its hand weapons there's 2 attacks come out of them, and they're Range 1, POW 6, POW plus Strength 12. When we flip over to the back of their card, we can see that the unit has Berserk, so when this model destroys one or more models with a melee attack during its combat action, immediately after the attack is resolved, it may make one additional, must make one additional melee attack against another model in its melee range. The ability Chemical Imbalance is something fairly new to the game, and it states at the start of this unit's activation, choose 2 of the following stats: Mat, Speed, or Strength. This unit gains +2 to one of the chosen stat and +1 to the other chosen stat. You choose which stat receives which bonus, and these bonuses last for 1 round. They also come with Hyper Regeneration, so you remove D3 damage points from the model at the start of each of its activations, and then Impervious Flesh rounds the unit out, where when this model suffers a damage roll, the damage roll rolls 1 fewer die. I don't know how many times I was going to say roll in that one. You'd think I'd be starting a bakery or something. But Impervious Flesh is just drop a die on a damage roll. Pretty nice ability. There's plenty of things in the game that have it. So when we take a look at their stats, that 15 armor on a medium-based unit doesn't really make a whole lot of sense until you factor in, Tough, Hyper Regeneration, and Impervious Flesh. They end up turning into a pretty resilient unit. So what kind of role do the failed experiments play in a Crucible Guard list? So, as the fluff blurb would kind of allude to, I do feel like these guys are supposed to be getting into the enemy's front lines and kind of mixing things up a little bit to kind of cause some havoc for them. They have Berserk, so every time they end up killing something, if you're looking at going into somebody's like Bubble Wrap or their screening unit, with 2 initial attacks and the ability to Berserk through those, that does a pretty significant amount of work to some of those units. Being able to use Chemical Imbalance to kind of cater the failed experiments to your needs. Like if your opponent has a really high def screen, you can go ahead and Chemical Imbalance to get +2 Mat to bring yourself to Mat 8, and then just bring yourself up to, POW plus Strength 13, or maybe even Speed 7 if you don't need to try and crack armor like crazy. I think that those, the ability to kind of tinker with them through Chemical Imbalance really makes them kind of fit into the Crucible Guard army real well. We've already seen that there are so many things in Crucible Guard that they adapt themselves to the situation at need. or the situation at hand. And the failed experiments do that pretty well through chemical imbalance. Even just going up to something like speed 8 and then going up to like mat 7, you're going to be connecting with those high defense screening units really, really early. And at speed 8, even with the 1-inch reach, you should be able to connect with things by just walking and punching too if you got that first turn and then did the +2 speed and ran 16 inches. I just think that the failed experiments are so versatile that they're really good with just kind of crashing into your opponent's stuff firsthand, and they even can do things like go into heavies because you're going up to POW plus strength 14, and then you don't really need the mat buff as much to be able to hit those warjacks or those heavies, and that can actually do a pretty decent amount of work between 2 attacks at POW 14 and then all the other buffs that you can get or debuffs that you can get in Crucible Guard. So that's how I feel these guys fit into the Crucible Guard army, is just being able to kind of be that frontline offensive to go in and cause as much havoc as possible for your opponent to deal with. Now, when we look at the failed experiments in terms of stats, 13-15 isn't a whole lot to write home about, even when we think about impervious flesh, tough, and rapid healing, or hyper regeneration, sorry. Armor 15, even with impervious flesh, isn't all that difficult to get through, but this is where we can start talking about synergies with the failed experiments if you want to try and play them a little bit more conservatively in order to try and get them up the table. The first thing I want to look at is another new-ish release for the Crucible Guard faction, and that's going to be the Ascendant Mentalist. Now, this lady is pretty nuts when it comes to just her raw offensive output. We're not going to talk about exactly what she ends up doing with that. I really want to focus in on what she does for the failed experiments, but we have 2 abilities here from her suite of magic abilities, and Force Aura is probably the first one you want to look at. With the immense speed of the failed experiments, you can kind of run them into position and then just leave a space for this Ascendant Mentalist to go up and then cast Force Aura so that anything within 3 inches of her gets, friendly faction at least, gets +2 defense and arm against ranged attacks. So this is going to be the model that you want to try and escort your failed experiments up the table. 13-15 isn't all that great, but 15-18 with impervious flesh is a pretty dang good stat, and I think the Ascendant Mentalist works really well there. If your opponent is unlucky enough to not scalpel the Ascendant Mentalist out, after the failed experiments end up connecting with your opponent, she can then switch over to the Psychokinetic Shield, which says, well, within 5 inches of the spellcaster, enemy models suffer -2 mat and rat, and additionally, any enemy models activating within 5 inches of the spellcaster can't run, charge, make slam, or trample power attacks. And then Psychokinetic Barrier lasts for 1 round. So this is another way to try and keep your unit offensively safe. It's not going to do much against the strength, but at least when someone's closing in with your lines, if that Ascendant Mentalist is sandwiched right into those failed experiments, she's going to make sure that they're really difficult to hit, and then that might transfer over to being able to make sure that Armor 15 with Impervious Flesh actually does quite a bit of work for you. And not being able to like charge within 5 is whatever. I don't feel like that's a big deal. That's maybe more of a little gotcha for placing her somewhere for a unit that might want to charge past her or around her, but for the most part, I'm really getting into this -2 mat and rat for being able to crush on them. She also, for what it's worth, has Battle Wizard, so if you want her to get into the business, if you're worried about like, oh, well, she's only speed 6, and you know that means that kind of hampers the ability of my failed experiments to run up the table, she can just kind of charge something, and then if she zaps it and Battle Wizards it, then the failed experiments can kind of run around her and make sure that she's got that buff up, and then those guys can kind of stand around and not just only make sure that she stays safe, but also make sure that they stay safe with whatever magic ability she decides to put up. So when we talk about synergy for units in War Machine, it's really difficult to not talk about the Warcasters as well. You kind of pick your Warcaster and then kind of assemble the army around it. So the first one that I want to touch on in terms of someone who really helps turn these guys up is going to be the obvious elephant in the room, and that's going to be Silvestro. So Aurum Adeptus Silvestro. So one of the first things that Silvestro does for them is being able to just kind of cast spells for free, or a spell for free at least. And the big reason why that's a huge deal is because he does have revive. So if your opponent does happen to find a way to start cleaving through failed experiments, you're able to try and bring these things back into play. Not only that, but we have the spell Transmutation that goes really well on them. They end up getting +2 strength and death, and then get Pathfinder as well. So they go up to that wonderful 15 defense. They go up to POW plus strength 14, and if you want to tinker that up, they go up to 16, and that's pretty decent. That's starting to really cripple heavies off of a couple swings here. Not to mention that Silvestro has the ability to purify any kind of nasty abilities that your opponent decides to put on them. And then we can't go without mentioning his feat, which just cranks their damage and accuracy up quite a bit with getting that additional die and dropping whichever one you feel like. And then the oft forgotten part of Silvestro's feat ends up coming into play with these guys a little bit, because you can start healing ones that have taken damage once you start pulling of some of your opponent's models off the table. So I think Silvestro is a pretty dang good caster for these guys, just because he has so many ways to, you know, pump them up and protect them. But Silvestro is just a good caster in general, so it's really not hard to imagine that he would be good for failed experiments. When it comes to Crucible Guard, it's really easy to say something like Silvestro is like an amazing caster for making something better, but I would be remiss if I did not mention one of my new favorite casters to play with the failed experiments, and that's going to be Aram Legat, or Legate. I don't know. This is weird Lely's language. Lucas de More. So Lucas is real fun for the failed experiments. He really is like kind of the Lucas show, but when you look at what he ends up bringing to the table, he has Burning Ash. So if your opponent isn't bringing anything to help see through clouds, this is a way to escort those failed experiments up the table without really needing to put a whole lot of effort in doing so. If you end up putting them right in front of the failed experiments, that ends up making sure that your opponent, as long as they're not immune to fire, and they're living, right? Yeah, living. You end up having -2 to hit. So they turn up to that defense 15. Not only that, but he has Iron Flesh, so they're immune to blast damage, and then they get +2 armor, so they go, essentially, if you're playing your clouds in an interesting way, you can go 15, 17, and then on top of that, it doesn't stop there. We can get a big threat extension with Telekinesis. You can start TKing failed experiments forward and your opponent forward and turning them around, not only giving you a threat extender but a map bonus. And then you also have Disintegration, so you can start getting out more damage amplification. So I think when it comes to the ability to kind of manipulate the table a bunch, failed experiments really like hanging out with Lucas, because he kind of just does so much for them. And then having that one unit being able to get up to armor 17 makes sure that Impervious Flesh actually does something for you, because at armor 15 I really don't feel like Impervious Flesh is doing you a lot of favors in this day and age. I think the War Machine meta has gotten so lethal that arm 15 Impervious Flesh just isn't what it used to be. But arm 17 with Impervious Flesh, now we're talking. And the inability to charge through Burning Ash, that's another big deal for it. So I think Lucas makes sure that the failed experiments do what they want to do. They get connected real quick, and then your opponent has to deal with them. And by the time they have, it's just like Lucas is positioned in a way to where not only is Warjax, but also he can just kind of do what he wants and execute his game plan, which is usually TK your caster all over the place and kill you, or make sure that he can slam you out of the zones and just close it out on scenario, because that's the classy thing to do. So there is something very unique about the failed experiments that can't be ignored, and it's more so not the failed experiments that are unique. It's more so that Privateer Press is kind of like crossed the streams of factions in the last couple years, and I cannot end this video or part ways with you all without mentioning Lely's Resistance. And when we talk about Lely's Resistance, I want to specifically talk about Ashlynn too. So in Lely's Resistance, you can select a couple units from a particular faction, whether that's Signar, Protectorate, or Crucible Guard, to end up accompanying the Lely's casters or Lely's army. So with Ashlynn too, if we end up selecting Crucible Guard as the army we're wanting to pick models from, there's a whole bunch of stuff she ends up doing for these failed experiments. The first thing is that she's got Hero of the People, so when she destroys one or more enemy models with a melee attack during her activation, all friendly faction warrior models get +2 to their attack rolls while in her command range of a whopping 9. So that means that you don't even need to worry about selecting the map bonus for chemical instability, because Ashlynn will just straight up do that as long as your opponent gives you something to put attacks into. The other cool thing is that she has Tactician Leylees, so when you select a Crucible Guard unit to go into the Leylees resistance, they become Leylees, just straight up. So you don't need the clouds in this list like you would in Lucas to make sure that your failed experiments get there. You can just put something else in front of them to make sure that they can then charge through that other unit and then kind of layer over there. They could even charge through themselves, which could be really interesting. But I think that Tactician is definitely, it's kind of like a crutch, but when you start being able to utilize it in a way to really abuse the table, I think that's when you start to realize it's not a crutch and that it's actually a really good tool that you can take advantage of. She does have Artifice of Deviation, so it is a way to make sure that, and we're looking at our spell list now for those watching at home. Well, you're all watching at home, or at least you're watching from somewhere, right? But anyway, Artifice of Deviation is a 5-inch AoE. You can easily fit a medium-based unit in that whole thing, and then they end up treating that as cover. The fun thing about that is that the Leylees resistance also drops a big old rubble terrain element. I'm sorry if you can hear my poor little puppy whining because I'm talking to all of you instead of him. But you can put this rubble thing down, and that'll let you that'll make sure that you can have cover on the other unit. So if you wanted to make sure 2 units got up the table and were protected from shooting, they get that +4 defense. That's really good for the failed experiments because they go up to defense 17. But now I'm sure you're all saying, but Brian, if we're going to be standing in rubble, how the heck are we going to get through it because these guys don't have Pathfinder? Well, Ashlynn, for the low cost of 3 focus, has True Path, so that's going to give friendly faction warrior models beginning their activations in her control range get +2 movement when advancing as part of their normal movement, and then gain Pathfinder as well. Now, if we stack that with chemical instability, these guys are threatening ridiculous ranges with a base movement of 10 inches. So we're looking at a 14-inch threat on the Crucible Guard failed experiments, and that is just ridiculously nasty. So when we talk about how else she can make sure that they survive, right? We're looking at Blood of Liberty. 2 focus, while in this model's control range, friendly living Leylees models gain tough, which they don't care about because they already have, but they also gain unyielding. So these guys go up to that wonderful armor of 17, which I think 17 is like the good point for impervious flesh, and that's just really good. She has an ability to extend their threat, make sure they survive defensively and armored, and then on top of that, she also has Hand of Fate. So if you want to throw Hand of Fate on one of these units, since you don't have to buff their speed or mat to make sure that they get somewhere, you can just buff their strength and make sure Hand of Fate's out there, and now you're doing tons of work with this unit. And her feat doesn't really matter too much. You can definitely bring some solos that can help pump that up, like in terms of like a rush shot or something like that. Or even Ragman, if you were trying to get there. I think Ragman's Leylees. No, he's Thamurite. But I want to say he's allowed in this theme, but I haven't 100% played it. All I can tell you straight off the bat is that Ashlynn 2 in Leylees Resistance with 2 units of failed experiments is really frickin' rude. And as much as I want to say like Crucible Guard is where they're at, I do feel like Crucible Guard lending their aid to the Leylees Resistance is really where these guys shine, and Ashlynn D'Elise, the Queen's Blade, is a perfect home for them. I hope you enjoyed this unit review. It's not something that I've really done before when focusing down on one thing, and I absolutely apologize for my dog flipping his shit, but what can you do? He's all of 3 months old and doesn't understand the world just yet. So let me know in the comments below if you have any suggestions for the future of videos like this, because I would like to do more. It's just that I'm still experimenting and trying to get back into this. I've done this so many times for A Song of Ice and Fire, which seems real easy to execute. But for War Machine, it is just so much more complex because there are so many moving parts and buffs and synergies and ways to apply them based on the scenario that I just would really appreciate all of your help in making sure that I'm putting out something that you really actually derive some value from. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to trying to make the next one of these for you, hopefully better than what this one was.